This is our third and final day of the Climate Adaptation Research for BC Agriculture Virtual Workshop. Hopefully, many of you have already had a chance to join some of our other sessions this week. If you've missed them, don't worry, they're recorded, and we're recording this session today too, and we'll be sharing those out later on. I'm Shauna McKinnon. I'm the coordinator for the BC Agricultural Climate Adaptation Research Network, and I also oversee the Climate and Agriculture Initiative's Applied Research Program. I'm hosting the session today from Vancouver on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the coastal Salish peoples, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. This is my third time organizing this annual workshop for ACARN. And I have to say, I thought the first one was pretty big. We had over 100 people in Kelowna in 2019. And last year we went to virtual. We had more than 300 people joining us. And this year our registration is like 550, something like that, over the 3 days. So it's pretty amazing to see the interest in this topic growing. But of course, there's a good reason. Climate change has become very real. The impacts are being felt significantly in BC. And I have to say that after the discussions earlier this week, I think we could spend so much more time working through these topics, from looking at the research to what can we implement on the ground right now, and looking at some of those long-term planning for resilience issues too. I'd love to hear people's ideas for future events and how you think we can build on these conversations. This is a little bit of a plug for a follow-up survey that's going to be hitting your email inbox after the workshop. But if you'd like to share a few ideas now in the chat about what you'd like to see for future events, I'd love to hear it. Or you can also always reach out to me by email. Also, one of the really cool things about ACARN events is that we get to bring together such a diverse audience, and this week has been no exception. So we have people joining from communities across BC. We have researchers from all different disciplines, farmers, ranchers, agrologists, planners, governments of all level, and interested citizens and students. So it's very cool to see such a diverse audience. So it's great to take a minute, introduce yourself in the chat, let people know who you are, where you're joining from. But I also would encourage everyone to stay connected with ACARN after the workshop. You can become a member and get our quarterly e-newsletter, which will keep you up to date on agricultural adaptation research. You can also follow us on social media through LinkedIn, Twitter, and Instagram. Building connections between people that are working on similar challenges in different places is one of the important roles of ACARN. So staying connected with the network can help you do that. Of course, the other great thing about ACARN is that I get to provide a platform to share research on adapting to climate change in the agriculture sector. It can be a bit terrifying at times looking at the science behind climate change and understanding how huge of an impact climate change is already having on agriculture and what's in store for us. But agriculture and the way we manage and relate to land also has the potential to be an important part of climate solutions. And that's what we'll be exploring today during both this morning's webinar and then the panel session that's going to follow at 10:30. So during this morning's webinar, we're going to start with Dr. Edward Borg, who's joining us from the University of Alberta. He's going to be sharing the results of many years of research into the carbon sequestration potential in Western Canada using grassland, grazing, and agroforestry. And he's going to do that all in a short amount of time. I'm sure there will be lots of questions for him to dig deeper into his research. And then we're going to have a presentation from Dr. Dr Fraser from Thompson Rivers University in Kamloops. And he's going to be discussing his research on grazing management practices in BC and what they can offer for carbon sequestration benefits, as well as greater resiliency to things like drought and intense precipitation. After each of our presenters, we'll have a break for Q&A, and you can type your questions into the Q&A box in the Zoom control panel. There's also an option there to upvote other people's questions by giving them a thumbs up, and that will bring the questions up to the top of the queue, and I can ask those ones first. So before I hand things over to our presenters, I wanted to say a thank you to our funders. Funding for this event has been provided in part by an anonymous donor and in part by governments of Canada and British Columbia under the Canadian Agricultural Partnership, which is a federal provincial territorial initiative. All right, so it's now my pleasure to pass things over to Dr. Edward Borg. Dr. Bork is the Mattheis Chair in Rangeland Ecology in Management and Director of the Rangeland Research Institute at the University of Alberta. He's been teaching and conducting research for more than 25 years on basic and applied topics, including integrated weed control, grazing systems, fire ecology, forage production, agroforestry, and recently the role of rangelands in providing alternative ecosystem goods and services, including carbon storage, greenhouse gas reduction, and biodiversity retention. It's great to have you joining us today. Welcome, Dr. Bork.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I appreciate the invite from Shauna. I appreciate that everyone is attending today. Can everyone see my screen? Is it looking all right? Hopefully.
Yeah, it looks good.
Okay, excellent. So Shauna has given me the task today of, in about 18 minutes, trying to encapsulate somewhere around a decade of research that we've been working on. Carbon in grasslands, carbon relative to the dominant land use of grazing within those grassland systems, and also a lot of agroforestry work that we've been doing over this time period. So the results that I'm going to present to you today are kind of high level results. I'm not going to dig down deep into them too much simply because I don't have the time. And I want to acknowledge that there's a lot of other individuals, particularly Cameron Carlisle and Scott Chang, Dr. Dan Hewins, and a number of grad students in the past and current that have all contributed to this. So this is very much a team effort that you're going to see today. And I want to start out with just the overarching research goal that we've had over the last decade. When we started this work, it was quite obvious, both on the agroforestry side and on the grazing management side, that really in order to promote the conservation and even the establishment, for example, of agroforestry systems, or conserve and promote the maintenance or improvement of grassland ecosystems, we needed to have a really strong empirical foundation for all of the environmental goods and services that those areas provide, but that includes carbon and greenhouse gas reduction. And because there wasn't a strong database in that area, it was really hard to create a business case to basically promote policies that would reward ranchers and farmers for maintaining or increasing the magnitude of that carbon storage. So at the very beginning of when we started down this road, we really had a number of objectives, if you like. The first and foremost, quantify the size and stability of carbon stores, regardless of if it was grasslands or whether it was these agroforestry systems. Understand the influence of land use change. So for example, forest removal, or in the case of grasslands, cultivation impacts on those stores. And then also understand land management impacts. So fine-tuning grazing management through grazing systems, or more recently, we're working on biochar addition on those carbon stocks. And the reason we want to understand that is because we want a predictive framework that will lead to BMPs, or beneficial management practices. So with that, I'm going to jump right into some of the results, and how I'm going to frame this is I'm going to work through a number of questions. So the very first question is, what is the role of grasslands in storing carbon? And how does land use conversion, which is still a widespread threat across much of the prairies, conversion to annual cropping, how does that impact carbon stock? So we're going to start out there. And to address this question, back in 2012, we established what we called the benchmarking study. So if you look on the map here on the right side of the screen, you'll see this shotgun blast of study sites across a really wide agroclimatic gradient, from the Saskatchewan border up into the foothills, and then from the Montana border all the way up to Edmonton. So it covered a really large range of soil conditions, vegetation types, climatic conditions, and so on. And we basically went out to these locations and we quantified the ecosystem carbon within these grasslands. And we did it also under both non-graze conditions, so inside protected exclosures where livestock grazing had been removed for 10, 20, 30, 40 years. And then we also did it outside in order to allow comparison between them. Then we also had another component here where we did some comparisons between perennial grassland and also adjacent areas that have been converted to cropland. So these are areas that are managed for wheat production, pulses, canola, barley, and so on in some type of fairly intensive system. So if we look at the results, the first thing I want to impart to everyone is just how much carbon is actually contained within our native grassland systems. So for example, across those 106 sites, we actually had an average of over 90 tons per hectare. So that's this bar basically here of carbon. And I want to point out that this is really an underestimate. And the reason it's an underestimate is we only sampled to 30 centimeter soil depth. So this is an inventory of the vegetation, the live, the dead, the roots, the soil or organic carbon and so on, but it doesn't look at the deep soil carbon. So this is an underestimate. And the other thing to note is that there's very large variation in the size of that carbon stock pool between, let's say, the mixed grass prairie, where it's around 60 tons of carbon per hectare, up into the moist grasslands of Western Alberta, where you're looking at upwards of 180 tons plus of carbon per hectare. And the other thing I want to point out here is we were quite surprised to find out just how much carbon is situated within what's called the mulch layer, or some people might think of it as this LFH layer, litter fiber humic layer. It's dead and decomposing material on the surface of the soil. And that pool of carbon alone was around 15 tons per hectare. And collectively, when you looked at the total carbon stock, it remained much higher in those native grasslands than what we found in both our introduced forages. So this is planted hayland and tame pasture, or the annual croplands. So big differences in the size of the carbon pool. The other thing I want to highlight is that where land use conversion has occurred, where we did these pairwise comparisons between the native grasslands and the adjacent annual systems, we basically had lost anywhere from 28 to 45% of the ecosystem carbon. The largest decline was actually in the parkland region. So that's the area where I'm situated here in central Alberta, where we generally have fairly favorable growing conditions. We have fairly favorable productivity, and yet where we had taken those native grasslands and converted them over to cropland, we lost almost half of the carbon from them. So this is an important point to make, and this is consistent with what studies globally show, that between 30 and 50% of the carbon is lost when you take these native grassland systems, plow them under and convert them to annual cropland. So there's a big penalty to pay in terms of carbon emissions. That carbon is released into the atmosphere. The other thing that we did is we combined our carbon data and how these differences relative to land use across the different agroclimatic regions of Alberta. We combined that information with ABMI data. That's the Alberta Biodiversity Monitoring Institute, that basically tracks land use patterns across the province. And by doing that, we were able to do a spatial assessment, essentially, of what has been the magnitude of carbon changes across the province. And we also attached a dollar value to it. Now, this is an older graph. So we are currently under federal, guidelines under a $40 per ton CO2 equivalent valuation. This graph is actually still for $30 per ton. So that was the price in 2020. And the numbers are quite mind-boggling when you look at this. I want to hone in on the right side of the graph. This basically represents the carbon that's been previously lost due to land use change. So where we've taken grassland, we've plowed it under and converted it to annual cropland. And if we take that carbon stock, apply this ABMI spatial footprint, land use footprint, and we use simply a $30 per ton CO2 equivalent value, the amount of carbon lost in the parkland alone, which is the Edmonton region, greater Edmonton region, is $22.5 billion. That's with a B, billion dollars. And even in the prairie environment, so the drier environments, the mixed grasslands of southern Alberta, it's roughly 8 billion. So combined, it's roughly $30 billion, and that's a conservative estimate given that that's based on a valuation of $30 per ton. If we use the $40 per ton equivalent today, or in January 2022, it's going to be $50. That number is going to be closer to $50 million. $50 billion, sorry. So it just shows you what a profound impact land use change has on both carbon stocks and the loss of carbon into the atmosphere. Okay, question 2. Does grazing increase or decrease carbon stocks? So can we fine-tune carbon stocks with grazing? This is going to be a bit of an oversimplification because we've been working on this for over a dozen years, and I have a lot of things I'd love to concentrate on, but I'm just going to give you the Coles notes. Bottom line is that grazing can indeed increase carbon. So our very first study in 2018 indicated that our soil carbon concentrations, particularly in the topsoil, the top 6 inches of soil, are actually 12% greater where we have this long-term grazing going on. Or looked at another way, where we remove grazing, we actually have 12% less carbon. The increases in ecosystem carbon stock, and this is a data set that's in prep for publication right now, are most likely to increase due to grazing in the higher rainfall areas. So in the parkland environments, foothill environments, or even the upper foothill environments. So as long as moisture is high enough to allow for a favorable grazing tolerance and a high degree of plant regrowth, that's where it appears that grazing induces these higher carbon stock responses. We also went back to ABMI again, and we took our carbon data and linked it to, again, the spatial footprint to try to figure out what has been the net impact of grazing and having grazing in the province of Alberta across all of these rangelands that cover such a broad, diverse environment. When we did this, this is the pattern that we ultimately got. And you can see, for example, in the parkland here in the Edmonton area, this is this net change in carbon. We indeed are getting that effect. We're getting that in the foothills fescue as well. Again, keeping in mind that we did not quantify deep soil carbon. So this is an underestimate potentially of the magnitude of the differences. When I applied a $40 per ton CO2 equivalent valuation, this is basically the results of that analysis. So here's our Aspen Parkland again. So this is the Edmonton region alone. I'm going to pick on that simply because that's where I'm located. The grazing induced change in ecosystem carbon is around 8 million tons of carbon. And when you take 8 million tons of carbon and you convert it over to CO2 equivalent, and then you attach this $40 per equivalency, that equates to roughly $1.2 billion worth of carbon. Again, that's with a B. And across all the grasslands in Alberta, the grazing induced change in carbon could be as large as $2.5 billion. So these numbers are really mind-boggling when you think about the impact that land use change and even fine-tuning something like grazing, how profound an impact it could have on the total carbon stocks. So that's really the point I'm trying to get across. Okay, question 3, I'm going to touch on only really briefly, because this is an hour-long talk in and of itself, which is how does grazing specifically alter carbon storage? So what's the mechanism? And again, the reason why we care about that is because if we understand the mechanisms, then we can start to develop specific BMPs, or beneficial management practices, that can be used to advise farmers and ranchers on how they can increase carbon stocks. I've taken a decade of research and squashed this down into one slide, and I'm not going to talk to all the points, but here's the Coles notes. In the work that we've done, grazing essentially has a cascade of effects. It increases plant diversity, including the abundance of broadleaf plants, which can trigger changes in soil organic carbon. Grazed environments also are subject to more rapid litter decomposition, and because grazing changes plant species composition, including of the dominant grasses, we can actually change the relative rate at which that carbon decomposes and gets returned to the soil. We're also finding differences in soil enzymes responsible for carbon turnover, and a recent study that was done by a postdoc here at the U of A indicates that where we use these intense defoliation regimes applied in a short period of time, that can actually cause plants to allocate more carbon below ground. And we've also done some work on mob grazing that shows that mob grazing can change not only plant productivity, but water infiltration and ultimately boost carbon storage. So there's a whole cascade of changes that ultimately that I feel are going to be influential in guiding us towards BMPs in the long run. Okay, I've got about 5 minutes left. So the last question is, how much does agroforestry contribute to carbon storage in Alberta? So this work was led by Scott Chang. I was a partner on that project. Cameron Carlisle was also involved. Started in 2012, looking at different agroforestry systems. The ones that we were specifically comparing included a silvopasture, which is basically a grazing of areas comprised of a mix of grassland and forest, and then either planted shelter belts, or in the case of naturally occurring hedgerows adjacent to annually cropped areas. And so that was the foundation for this particular study. And then later on in the process, we also did a landscape level scaling up assessment, where we used a series of 50 plots to look at the relative size of the footprint of these different activities across the landscape. Okay, here's the Coles Notes version, key results again. First thing I want to point out is that the silvopastures actually contain more carbon in the very topsoil, the top 10 centimeters. And the way I tend to think about this is that the reason that the silvopasture systems had actually more carbon in the topsoil is not so much because of the trees, but rather because both the aspen and the grassland are both perennial vegetation types. In comparison, the shelter belt and hedgerow systems actually were paired with a cropland, and the croplands essentially reduced the amount of carbon that was within those systems. Another important finding is that our silvopasture systems actually had a lower, what we call global warming potential, which is the aggregate effect of carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and methane. And again, it's because the perennial dominated land use system comprised of the perennial grassland and the forest combined actually were better able to not only reduce CO2, but also, for example, take up more methane from the atmosphere. And methane is a relatively potent greenhouse gas. Okay, I got a couple final slides to kind of wrap this up. So one thing I want to stress, forests are clearly a very valuable contributor to carbon storage. This data was recently published, and it basically looks at the magnitude of the carbon storage in tons per hectare. You can see that the croplands are by far and away the lowest in terms of the carbon storage. All of the forested systems indeed stored a lot of carbon, in part because the biomass itself is a very large reservoir. So the tree and shrub biomass is a very large pool of carbon. In addition, much like what we saw in the perennial grassland study that we did, the LFH layer, so that decomposing layer of variably deposited and decomposing material on the surface of the mineral soil, is also a very sizable pool of carbon and can represent as much as 10% of the carbon within these ecosystems. Okay, here's the results of some of our scaling work, which I think you'll be very interested in. And so this basically really drives home the fact that even though croplands are the most abundant land use area across, for example, Alberta. So in central Alberta, croplands represented 55% of the spatial land area in the Edmonton region. However, when we look at the total carbon stock, only about 46% of the total carbon within that area was associated with croplands. So they're actually undervalued or overvalued, I guess, in terms of what they're bringing to the table in terms of carbon stock. But look at the silvopastures down here. Silvopastures only represented just over 20% of the landscape across this area. And yet they contained upwards of 33% of the total carbon stock, which means they're clearly undervalued because they're containing proportionally more carbon relative to these other land uses, particularly croplands. So these forested systems are incredibly important for storing carbon. Another thing that we did is we looked back retrospectively using archived photos to figure out how much forest have we actually lost in central Alberta. Here's the data from 2000 to 2020, and the Coles notes are that we've lost on average 2,500 hectares a year of either silvopasture forests or natural hedgerows for a total of almost 50,000 hectares. And when you look at the decline, so the amount of loss of carbon stock, because of the loss of those forests, we've averaged 0.4 million tons of carbon per year that we've been losing on an annual basis. So again, significant value being lost because of this slow chronic attrition of forests. And the last thing we did is we went and looked at the area or the linear length of non-forested road field margins that could be planted to shelter belts, which came to more than 46,000 kilometers. If in a perfect world, we were to convince landowners to plant shelter belts on those 46,000 kilometers, we could sequester an additional almost 22 million tons of carbon, which would be worth an estimated $3.2 billion. Now, that's using today's value of $40 per ton of CO2. And of course, it won't happen overnight. It would take many decades for that carbon to accrue. Okay, so just some closing thoughts. Hopefully, I've convinced you that grasslands and agroforests are very large storehouses of biological carbon. They're currently undervalued by society and have very high potential for mitigating rising CO2. Grazing alters community composition and nutrient cycling in really complex ways, and in some cases can actually help contribute to carbon accumulation. And forest loss is leading to the loss of large amounts of carbon, and tree planting could help reverse that loss. And the last point I'll make is that, in my opinion, we're at the point where we desperately need policy changes that fully value carbon currently held in grasslands and agroforests. And really, we need to move to the next level of incentivizing farmers and ranchers to maintain and increase these stocks, especially and that shouldn't be difficult when you think about that we're currently at $40 per ton CO2 evaluation, and yet by 2030, we're projected to be at $170 per ton. So you can take all the numbers I gave you and multiply them by more than 4, and that's what they'll be worth in 2030. Okay, thank you. And I look forward to any questions.
Thank you so much. I think you're getting the Zoom equivalent of a standing ovation right now. I can see all these comments coming in through the chat. That was incredible, compacting the decades of research and giving us some of those high-level takeaways of the importance of these agroforestry systems and grazing for carbon sequestration. We have tons of questions already. Please put your questions in the Q&A, and also you can upvote them. So those ones will rise to the queue, and I'll ask those first. I also just want to let people know we will run the session a little bit past the hour, so we'll take time taking questions, and then if there's extra questions, we'll have our speakers provide answers to those in a written form, and we'll share them out afterwards. So please put your questions in, even though there's already a lot in there. So I'm going to get started here with the first question. How much of the differences seen in carbon stocks do you think are related to differences in bulk density?
Very good question. So in the work that we are doing, we are trying to use equivalent soil mass because we know that that's a potential risk. And that's particularly important, for example, in the agroforestry work. So the work that we're doing there in our AMP study, where we're looking at mob grazing, and we're worried about potential compaction from high densities of animals that could actually lead to soil compaction. So as much as possible, we're trying to use equivalent soil mass, which then gets us beyond that issue of changes in bulk density. But it is a really good point.
So another question on soil carbon. So a couple of times you referenced the below 30 centimeters soil. How does that typically differ from the top 30 centimeters? And what variables influence the carbon content differences between those two depths?
Okay, so another really good question. So we couldn't go deeper than 30 centimeters simply because we piggybacked our benchmarking study on top of the Alberta government rangeland exclosure system, and they wouldn't allow us to go in and rip open their fences and take coring trucks in there and go down to a meter. But there is a very common kind of thinking that some of the deep carbon changes in response to grazing, for example, may be some of the more important components that may lead to long-term sequestration. So that is possible. What I will say is that in our AMP study, where we sampled soil from 64 ranches across Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, we did go down to a meter. So our latest data sets that we are analyzing do go all the way down to a meter. And I can tell you that we are not seeing changes in carbon down deep. Where we are seeing changes in carbon relative to the type of grazing on the surface of the soil, it's really concentrated in the top 15 centimeters. Now, having said that, one can always argue you need really, really large sample sizes to pull apart differences in soil carbon that are deep, deep down that may be different by only 1 or 2%. And that could well be. And that's a statistical challenge that every researcher is kind of facing. But the responses we are seeing are concentrated really by and large in the most biologically active portion of the soil, which is the top 15 or 30 centimeters.
Great. And as a follow-up question to that, so looking at native prairie versus grasslands, how likely is it that all the carbon stored in the top layers, the mulch layers of soil, are going to volatilize into the atmosphere versus getting incorporated and locked into the deeper layers of soil over time?
Also a really good question. So we are very transparent in not wanting to attribute what's in that mulch layer to the actual mineral soil layer for a couple of reasons. Now, on one hand, it is sequestered carbon, so we don't want to ignore it. It's there, it's important, it's valuable. However, the degree of protection of that carbon is nowhere near as high as it is for the soil mineral carbon, because anything that's in the mineral soil is obviously more resistant to above ground disturbances. For example, fire. If we have an intense fire sweep across either a forest system or a grassland, that mulch and LFH layer is going to burn off and it's going to be gone. So I don't want to downplay the importance of that LFH layer, but I also want to be very transparent that it's shorter term sequestration and it's at risk. What we do not understand is what is the transition of the carbon from that LFH layer down into the deeper soil profile. And how much of it is dissolved carbon that's moving down there? How much of it is soil microfauna that are moving it down there into different layers? Or are there other vehicles, mechanisms by which it's getting down there? So there's a lot of unresolved questions. We are aware of all of these different pieces, and we're trying to nibble away at them, and hopefully one day we'll have it all figured out. Although it'll probably take, not just my professional career as a researcher, but many others as well to parse it apart. These are complex systems. And I can tell you that the folks that work in croplands probably have an easier job because everything's homogenized. Grasslands are not. They're temporally and spatially a dog's breakfast. And because of that, they're difficult to work in.
Yeah, thank you for that thorough answer on such a complex question. So another question here I'm going to ask, and then I think I'm going to pass it over to Locke. Did you compare different grazing systems? So for example, looking at intensive rotations, and then if you did look at those different systems, did you look at both the quality of the forage and the carbon sequestration?
So in our benchmarking study, we did not. We only looked at binary, was it grazed or not? Okay, and that was one of the weaknesses of that study. But the benefit is we had an enormous number of sites, 106 locations, which you typically don't find. We have two other studies. One has been published out of Saskatchewan looking at mixed grasslands, where we actually have stalking rate data, long-term cattle stalking rate data. And we actually have found, again, a positive increase in the amount of carbon in the topsoil, the top 15 centimeters, in relation to increasing stalking rates. And that signal is actually stronger than precipitation itself, ironically. And when I first saw it, I thought, no, it can't be, it must be coincidence. And no, when we normalize the stalking rates for rainfall, we actually still see that signal. It's coming out loud and clear. So to answer the question about grazing systems, we actually did do that in our latest study that's looking at adaptive multi-paddock grazing. And that's a comparison of 32 different AMP operators in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta. And then we compare them to the neighbor. Now, the neighbor is not always, the neighbor is what I call a grab bag of different management practices. Some of them are AMP, some of them are almost AMP, some of them are continuous, some of them are slow rotation grazers. So, and in that analysis, so it's very representative of the type of variation we see among management practices on cow-calf systems. And when we go through that, the grad student who's actually writing that up has still got to defend, but we have that analysis done. And it's actually quite intriguing that there is a potential positive link between the use of these multi-paddock grazing systems, so high density mob grazing, coupled with a higher stalking rate that actually allows us to build more soil carbon. And again, it's not deeper down, it's in the topsoil. So that is unpublished. So it's kind of hot off the press, and hopefully you will see that out in a publication one day soon as well.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I think that's an excellent segue to our next speaker. Dr. Bork, if you'd like to type a few answers in the Q&A, you could do that now. Otherwise, we can get to them later. But right now, I'd like to introduce Dr. Lauchlan Fraser. Dr. Fraser is a professor and NSERC Industrial Research Chair in Ecosystem Reclamation and former Canada Research Chair in Community and Ecosystem Ecology at Thompson Rivers University in Kamloops. His expertise is in grassland and wetland ecosystems with a focus on range management, climate change, biodiversity, and ecosystem reclamation. He's also been a dedicated steering committee member of the Agricultural Climate Adaptation Research Network since its inception, for which I'm very appreciative. Welcome, Dr. Fraser. It's so nice to have you presenting today.
Thanks so much, Shauna. Welcome, everybody. And I'm speaking to you from Kamloops. I'm grateful to be a guest living on the ancestral, traditional, and unceded territories of the Secwepemc Nation. Edward gave a great overview, and my talk is mainly going to be a focus on grazing management. Let me see if I can advance my slide. Here we are. And I'll start with this. So what we see here is a model that demonstrates three hypothetical scenarios as a response to grazing intensity. And grazing intensity is on the x-axis here, increasing left to right. On the y-axis, we have the hypothetical change in forage production as well as carbon sequestration. And this is the 0 point. So at the 0 point, there is no effective grazing. And there's three possible scenarios. A shows that under this scenario, there's a negative response to grazing with respect to forage production and carbon sequestration. The second scenario, B, shows that there's no response up to Gmax, and at that point, there is a negative response to grazing. But the third scenario shows that there's actually an increase in forage production as well as carbon sequestration. And you've heard some of the mechanisms that are responsible for that from Edward's talk. And I'd like to dig a little deeper into that. But basically, this is a compensatory growth response, and it doesn't happen with all systems, but certain plant species actually increase their relative growth rate as a response to grazing. It's an induced response. They increase their growth rate. And because plants have a stoichiometric balance between above ground and below ground, when a grass is grazed, they have basal meristematic tissue, and so they can regrow at the base. But when grass is grazed above ground, there's an imbalance between leaves and roots. And so there's a response to the grass is to slough fine roots into the soil. So not only do you have an induced response to grazing with increased growth rate, you have root material being deposited into the soil. So let's look a little bit deeper at this compensatory growth response. This study was published recently, and it's an Inner Mongolian grassland. And this is a 4-year study, and these plots were the treatment was a cutting at different stubble heights. At 14, well, we've got our control here. 14 centimeters, 12, 10, 8, 6, and 0 centimeters. And what we see here is that at 14 stubble height, 12, 10, and 8, there is no significant difference in the total biomass with control. This is after 4 years. 4 years of growth with those stubble heights being maintained on a yearly basis. And at the end of 4 years, the overall biomass was harvested, and there's no difference in above ground biomass. And that doesn't account for all of that biomass that was removed every year. And it's only when we get into 6 and 0 centimeter stubble height that we see a reduction in overall biomass. We're replicating this study. Sarah Bailiff is a master's student at TRU. She has a family ranch up in the Chilcotin, and she is right now analyzing her data after 2 years. And the stubble heights are 0, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, and 30 centimeters. And what she's also doing here is measuring below ground biomass, because that is something that the study in Mongolia did not include. You're looking at a slightly different graph here, because all this is showing is the biomass that was collected after the first harvest. So obviously you're going to see higher biomass taken at the 0 stubble height, but the regrowth in just 1 season is quite remarkable, even for 0. We won't get the final results until she's analyzed them, and she is working on that and writing that up. You can see here that there's no response in roots, but that's only after the first year. We haven't looked at the second year yet. So stay tuned for that, because some really interesting results I'm hoping will come from this. So we see compensatory growth as a response. And there are other effects of grazing on plant communities. And once again, this was touched on by Edward. This study shows the response of grazing to plant diversity, and it's a global study. All of these points here on this world map are the locations of where the data was collected. And each data point represents a range reference area, basically the comparison between grazed and ungrazed systems with respect to plant diversity. And many of those plots were taken from our sites in British Columbia using our range reference areas. And this figure on the right here it simply demonstrates that there is a wide variation in mean annual precipitation across these global grasslands. So this shows that there's huge variation in plant productivity because mean annual precipitation is reflective of plant productivity. And what the results show, once again, this is the y-axis represents the effect of herbivores on richness, where we do have a zero line, and so any point that falls above this zero line reflects that there's a positive effect of grazing on species diversity. And what this shows is a line of best fit across this data, and we've got a wide range of plant productivity on the x-axis, and this line of best fit is always above the zero line, which is we kind of knew that we've known for a long time that grazing affects species richness. But there was mixed evidence on whether that positive effect occurs at low productivity. What this data shows and reflects is that even at low productivities, grazing can increase plant diversity. And what does that mean? Well, we can see from this recent study where this group looked at different community types, forest, shrubland, and grassland. I'll focus mostly on the grassland. And on the x-axis here, we have species richness. So that's our diversity metric. And we can see that species richness increases with annual net primary productivity. And species richness also increases with soil organic carbon. So if we have higher species richness as a result of grazing, we can also expect a higher soil organic carbon. Once again, it was great to have Edward talk before me because I'm reinforcing a lot of the information that Edward has shared. And I want to show this slide because it's important that you understand that there are differences in carbon pools depending on grassland type. And these carbon pools are of grasslands that we collected near Kamloops in the Lac du Bois protected grasslands. And we have 3 grassland types based on an elevation gradient, with the upper elevation, upper grasslands being the most productive fescue grasslands, the lower grasslands being the less productive bunch grass, sagebrush grasslands. And you can see Edward was talking about 0 to 30 centimeters. Well, we have fairly equivalent carbon stocks that we measured in our grasslands. If you add these two, for the upper grasslands, our more productive grasslands, they're close to 80, and this is equivalent to about 80 tons per hectare, kilograms per meter cube. So our values are equivalent, but the important thing to note is that different grasslands have different carbon stores, and these are often reflecting different productivity types as a result of different mean annual precipitation. And another point that's important to consider is that grazing can influence carbon stores, and even the seasonality of grazing can influence carbon stores. So this study was a long-term project carried out by the Agri-Food Canada Research Station that used to be located in Kamloops. And for about 10 years, one of the middle grassland pastures was only fall grazed, and one of the middle grassland pastures was only spring grazed, and fall grazed pastures had more carbon stored than spring grazed. Okay, so we've covered very quickly some of the effects of grazing and touched on some of the mechanisms. Grazing induces a compensatory growth response. Grazing increases species richness and diversity. And as a result, grazing has the potential to increase carbon stores in soils. We wanted to look at particular grazing management practices, specifically management-intensive grazing, or as Edward called them, adaptive multi-paddock grazing. And this is a system of forage use in which herds are regularly and systematically moved to fresh, rested areas with the intent to maximize the quality and quantity of forage growth. You could think of this as being on a grazing continuum. And here, extensive refers to the more traditional approach to grazing, large areas and fewer animals. And the intensive grazing management is higher density animals, shorter time periods. As a result, it's more labor intensive because you have to be constantly moving your herd. So Dan Denisick was the master's student who started this project about 10 years ago or so. And we connected with a number of different ranches, mostly in the Caribou-Chilcotin region, but also down in the Thompson, Nicola. And these were ranches that had been applying this management-intensive grazing, but also had neighboring pastures. So very similar to Edward's study in many ways. The neighboring pasture was the traditional style. And this just simply demonstrates the approach and the fact that typically electric fencing is used to manage the cattle, often on a daily basis. And based on this work and the data that was collected from the top 15 centimeters, the management intensive soils had more carbon than the extensive, as total carbon as well as organic carbon. We were also, Edward talked a little bit about carbon by depth. We did look a little into at least down to 50 centimeters. And at least in this study, you can see that management intensive over the first about 18 centimeters or so had higher levels of carbon. But after 20 centimeters, it was fairly equivalent to the traditional extensive managed soil rangelands. So one of the issues with Dan's data and working with ranchers is that each ranch ran their management intensive operations slightly differently. So although we could make these comparisons and we can draw certain conclusions based on these correlations, it's not a controlled experiment. So Christy Gordon has taken this approach to a much more controlled level, and she has tested extensive versus intensive in a very controlled manner. And we also looked at targeted grazing as an aspect of this study. So I'll talk just a little bit about that. But the major focus was on soil carbon. This grazing trial was conducted near Merritt, and we established 50 by 50 meter paddocks. And the extensive grazing paddock was a 1 cow-calf pair for 10 days in mid-September. management intensive was 10 cow-calf pairs for 1 day during that same mid-September period. The targeted grazing was similar to management intensive grazing in that it was 10 cow-calf pairs for 1 day. But it was in late July, and that's this area was infested with knapweed, spotted knapweed. And late July is a good time to target spotted knapweed because it's vulnerable to grazing. It's basically when it's starting to flower. We also had our control ungrazed exclosures. So there's Mark Haywood Farmer running the electric fencing on the pasture. You can see the spotted knapweed here in purple. This is our management intensive grazing with the 10 cow-calf pairs. And this is the extensive 1 cow-calf pair after about 8 days. And you can see that there's quite a heavy grazing after 8 days with only just 1 cow-calf pair because they've been there for so long. So once again, this is another project where the student who's conducting this research is still writing up. And so all I can present to you right now is very preliminary data looking at the plant community. And what this shows is that the extensive grazing reduced the grasses, and extensive is here with respect to management intensive grazing, more grasses and management intensive grazing. But of course, the major focus here is soil carbon, but I don't have that data to show you. But once again, this will be perhaps more informative when we do get this data. And I mentioned the spotted knapweed and the targeted grazing. And as you can see, targeted grazing reduced the number of mature seeds per plant as well as the number of seed heads per plant dramatically. So targeted grazing is, and just as a side note, a number of ranchers have raised the issue about nutritional quality of spotted knapweed. We did nutritional analysis of spotted knapweed compared to the native grasses on site. Spotted knapweed was actually higher in protein than the native grasses at that time of the year, so a good forage source. So to summarize, it's just a very quick and easy summary. Management practices can influence forage productivity and soil carbon sequestration in grasslands, and we have evidence to show that, and we're still building more support for that argument. And a number of funders have supported this research, and I thank you for your attention. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Luck. It was great to get a chance to dig into some of those comparisons between different types of grazing systems. We will stay on probably about 10 minutes past the hour, so feel free to type in your questions in the Q&A and also upvote them. I know we're getting a mix of some of the previous questions, even though Dr. Bork has been working hard on typing in answers. I'm going to start here with a question for you, Luck. Do you know what's going on with the differences in response between soil organic carbon and total carbon in your grazing intensity experiments? Why is the total carbon looking more significant? And what's the role of bulk density, do you think, in these differences?
So they are very similar, total carbon and soil organic carbon. Though soil organic carbon, the methodology obviously is different. Soil organic carbon is measured in our system through ignition using a muffle oven. And elemental carbon is used with an elemental analyzer. And so it is total carbon is going to include mineral and organic carbon. It will include basically all aspects of carbon without discrimination. Bulk density is very important, that is one of the variables that we use to calculate carbon stocks in soils. So it's important to have that info. It doesn't, it's not related to the variable that is soil organic carbon, but we do use bulk density in order to calculate carbon stores.
Oh, great, I was muted. Thanks for that answer. Here's another question, looking more at the intervals between different grazing types. Can you comment on the rest interval between instances of grazing and any variables that change the rest interval, such as precipitation, species composition, or day or nighttime temperatures?
Well, Wendy Gardner is a colleague of mine at TRU, and she's done some research on rest intervals, and there is the theory that a grass requires at least 7 days rest before being regrazed at the bare minimum. But often, I mean, that's often in thinking about tame pasture. And it also really depends on the season, and that sort of reflects precipitation. Edward was talking a little bit about precipitation and the effects, the correlation between mean annual precipitation, grazing, and carbon stores, and we've found very similar relationships. So often the response of grazing to soil carbon is determined by mean annual precipitation. So those areas that receive more precipitation are more likely to show a positive response in soil carbon to a grazing event.
Interesting. So changing the focus a bit, you did touch on the new research that you're doing looking at targeted grazing and invasive species. So could you just speak a little bit more about how grazing affects the relative diversity of native species and or invasive species, and how that could have other negative environmental impacts?
Right. And that's a good question. It wasn't really teased apart in the global study that I presented. That line that showed the effect of grazing on species richness was always positive, even at low productivities. But it wasn't identified, whether those was possibly an effect of non-native species increasing in those areas that were grazed. We do need to look more carefully at that. We do know that overgrazing it can influence the introduction of non-native invasive species. Non-native invasive plants have particular traits that make them competitively dominant in disturbed systems. They are competitively superior in many ways to native species. That's an important trade-off, and we certainly want to ensure that there is a balance in our grazing management systems. We don't want to overgraze. And one of the factors I think that is important with management intensive grazing is the fact that you're moving these animals quickly through the system. They don't spend long. And ideally, they don't take more than 50%. In fact, in some cases, much less than 50% of the forage when they're there, and that's something also to consider in grazing management.
Great, thank you. I'm going to just close with one last question that's directed to both of you. And you both have done so much research in this area looking at soil organic carbon. What depth would you recommend measuring carbon in soils? I know this is actually a much tougher question than it seems. Locke, do you want to?
Well, I mean, I think if I jump in first, just because I've got the floor, I would say that 0 to 30 centimeters reflects a lot of the dynamic change that is more evident on a short-term basis. So if you want to measure short-term change in carbon as a result of management changes, you should be able to see that within the top 30 centimeters. But I also agree that, occasionally, especially when we're trying to assess stock, it's important to get a better handle on deeper soil cores.
Thanks. Edward, do you want to jump in with a few thoughts on that one?
Sure. Yeah, I think it goes back to context. Why do you want those samples? So if you want to develop a total inventory and a total stock measurement, you have to go deep. But if you're trying to do a sensitivity test to a land use impact, by and large, I would say probably save your money and concentrate on where most of the short-term biological changes are going to happen, which is in the top 15 or 30 centimeters. So it really depends on context, because getting deep soils is expensive, and processing all of those different layers is very time consuming and very expensive to do. So if you think about, for example, carbon accounting, if we're going to track changes of deep soil carbon over time, it is going to take a Herculean effort to get enough samples and enough sensitivity to find a change in that carbon. So that would not be my priority unless you're trying to look at the total carbon stock. And there's many reasons to go deep, by the way, because we did find, for example, a lot of inorganic carbon as well at depth. And we found significant differences in inorganic carbon, so carbonates, between cropland, for example, and the adjacent areas that had never been worked. And the forests in particular had a lot of inorganic carbon, or our native systems had a lot of inorganic carbon. And so we're trying to figure out, well, why is that? Is it something to do with the cultivation and the change in soil pH, with fertilizer that's changing the acidity, and we don't know. We're delving into things that we're scratching our head going, there's more happening here than we really understand.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your presentations today. It was so informative. And you did such a great job answering many questions that I've heard people asking kind of over and over, and you've really done the work to bring some numbers to bear. And I know there's still a lot to understand about these mechanisms, but you've done so much work in figuring out what this means and how to work with these systems to sink more carbon. Thanks to everyone who joined us today. Thank you for all those excellent questions. I know we didn't get to quite all of them, but we will follow up with answers in the follow-up email after the workshop. Also, just want to get a plug for people who want to join the 10:30 a.m. panel, where we're going to be continuing to talk about carbon sequestration, be talking about on-farm implementation, all the way to some of the verification pieces. The login is being shared in the chat. And if you want to keep the discussion going and stay connected with ACARN, I welcome you to follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter. And with that, yeah, thank you so much, everyone, and hope to see you again at 10:30.